I had perfected the art of becoming architecture. To stand so still in an alcove, with the cold stone of my father's house seeping into the thin silk of my dress, that I might be mistaken for a column. A decorative, if somewhat plain, feature of the room. This was my purpose at such gatherings, to be present but unseen, a silent testament to my father's first unfortunate marriage. My stepmother, Lady Isolde, insisted upon it. "It shows a dutiful spirit, Alara," she would say, her voice a confection of spun sugar laced with arsenic. "To know one's place." My place was here, in the shadows, while my half-sister, Rosalind, shimmered like a freshly minted coin in the center of the ballroom. Tonight, the humiliation was a particular vintage, sharp and bitter on the tongue. My father was hosting this ball to celebrate Rosalind's engagement to a viscount, a man whose chin was as weak as his pedigree was strong. To ensure the room felt full and vibrant, Isolde had instructed the footman to remove several chairs from the periphery, including, pointedly, the small velvet stool that usually occupied this alcove. "We simply must have more room for dancing, darling," she had chirped, her eyes flicking to me, cold and hard as river stones. "You don't mind standing, do you? You have such a strong constitution." It was not a question. It was a command, delivered for the benefit of the listening maids. I was to be a statue for the evening, so I stood, my feet already aching, and watched. I watched my father, Lord Valerius, laugh a little too loudly at the Viscount's vapid jokes, his face flushed with wine and relief. He was a man who craved a quiet life above all else, and I was a discordant note in his carefully composed symphony of peace. He loved me, I supposed, in the abstract way one loves a memory, but my living presence was an inconvenience he allowed Isolde to manage. And manage me she did, with brutal, smiling efficiency. Rosalind was beautiful, I could not deny it. She moved with an unthinking grace that I, with my quiet considerations and love of straight lines and solid foundations, could never emulate. She was all light and air, her laughter like the tinkling of a chandelier. She was not cruel, not intentionally. She was simply oblivious, wrapped in the warm cocoon of favor that had been hers since birth. She would occasionally catch my eye from across the room and offer a small, pitying smile, as if I were a charity case she was vaguely fond of. It was, in its own way, more painful than Isolde's overt malice. The air in the ballroom thickened. A ripple, starting at the grand entrance, spread through the crowd. Voices hushed. The musicians, sensing the shift, softened their melody. I leaned forward, just an inch, my spine protesting the movement. He had arrived. Duke Alaric of Blackwood. The man was less a person and more a geological event. He was the wealthiest, most powerful man in the kingdom, owner of vast northern territories rich with iron and coal. He was also a recluse, a specter who haunted the edges of society, appearing so rarely that his presence was a legend. Rumor said he was haunted by the death of his younger brother years ago, a loss that had carved the severity into his face and chilled the warmth from his eyes. He was tall, dressed in unforgiving black that seemed to absorb the candlelight, and his expression was a mask of cold neutrality. The great flock of society parted for him. Ambitious mothers pushed their daughters forward. Men of influence angled for a moment of his attention. My father and Isolde practically flew to his side, their faces stretched into masks of fawning welcome. Isolde's voice, usually so sharp, was now a syrupy murmur. "Your Grace, what an unexpected honor! We are overwhelmed." The Duke's gaze swept the room. It was not a casual glance, it was an assessment, a quiet inventory of every soul present. His eyes, the color of a winter storm, passed over the glittering chandeliers, the sweating musicians, the hopeful faces of the debutantes. They passed over Rosalind's radiant smile and my father's nervous deference. And then they stopped. They stopped on me. It was a sensation so foreign I almost flinched. To be seen. Not just noticed, but truly seen, as if he had peeled back the layers of shadow and silence to look at the person hiding within. For a long, breathless moment, the world narrowed to the space between the severe, unreadable man at the center of the universe and the forgotten girl in the alcove. I felt a flush of heat crawl up my neck. I wanted to shrink, to melt into the stone behind me. He said nothing. He simply held my gaze. Then, he turned his head slightly, his attention now on my father, though his eyes did not leave my corner of the room entirely. My father was babbling something about the quality of the champagne. The Duke cut through his sycophantic chatter with a voice that was low, precise, and carried the weight of absolute authority. "Bring me the one they wouldn't let sit down," the Duke said. The music screeched to a halt as a violinist's bow skittered across the strings. A collective gasp, 100 indrawn breaths, created a vacuum in the room. And my father, Lord Valerius, with a glass of claret halfway to his lips, choked on his wine. He coughed, a wet, sputtering sound that was grotesquely loud in the sudden, profound silence. Isolde's face, a moment ago a study in rapturous welcome, had frozen into a rictus of disbelief and fury. Her perfectly manicured hand clenched at her side. She stared at me, her eyes spitting venom, as if I had orchestrated this somehow. As if I, in my prison of invisibility, possessed such power. The Duke did not repeat himself. He did not need to. His command hung in the air, glittering and sharp as a shard of ice. He was still looking at me, his expression unchanged, waiting. The entire world was waiting. My father, having recovered from his fit, wiped his mouth with a trembling hand. He looked from the implacable Duke to me, his eyes wide with a confusion so profound it was almost comical. Your Grace," he stammered. I don't understand." "It seems a simple enough request, my lord," the Duke replied, his voice dangerously soft. "There is a lady standing in that alcove. She has been standing there all evening. I wish to speak with her. Have her brought to me." Brought to him. Like a curiosity, like a piece of furniture he had taken a sudden interest in. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the haze of shock. This had to be a game, a cruel public jest at my expense. Men of his stature did not notice women like me, unless it was for their own amusement. I pressed myself harder against the wall, wishing for the stone to swallow me whole. Isolde found her voice first. She glided forward, a serpent in shimmering satin. "Your Grace, you must forgive us. That is merely Alara, my husband's eldest. She is of a retiring nature. She prefers the quiet. I'm sure you would be far more comfortable speaking with my daughter, Rosalind. She has just been engaged to the Viscount." "I am not interested in your daughter, Rosalind," the Duke stated, the words falling like chips of granite. He did not even glance at my sister, who stood frozen, her perfect smile faltering. "I am interested in Alara." He said my name. The sound of it from his lips was both foreign and definitive. "Is there some reason she cannot be brought here? Is she unwell?" "No, not at all," my father rushed to say, his face slick with sweat. He finally turned to me, his expression a frantic plea. "The Lara, child, His Grace wishes to speak with you." Every eye in the room was a physical weight, pressing down on me. I felt stripped bare, the carefully constructed shell of my invisibility shattered. Taking a breath that felt like swallowing sand, I forced my numb legs to move. I stepped out of the alcove, out of the shadows, and into the unforgiving glare of the candlelight. The journey across the polished floor felt like traversing a vast, empty desert. Each step was an agony of self-consciousness. I could feel their stares, their whispers starting up like the rustle of dry leaves. Plain, awkward, who is she? I kept my eyes down, focused on the intricate pattern of the parquet floor, until I stood before him. I could smell the scent of clean linen, cold night air, and something else, something like iron and earth. I dared to lift my gaze. Up close, he was even more imposing. The lines around his eyes were deeper than I had thought, etched not by age, but by something more profound. Sorrow, perhaps, or immense, unyielding focus. "Your Grace," I managed, my voice a threadbare whisper. I curtsied, my movements stiff and clumsy. He did not smile. He simply nodded, a curt, economical gesture. "You have been standing for over 2 hours," he said. It was not a question, it was a statement of fact. He had been watching. The thought sent a tremor through me. "Are you not tired?" I was so stunned by the directness of it, by the simple human inquiry, that I could only nod mutely. He turned his gaze back to my father and he sold. "You will find a seat for Lady Alara. Now," his eyes narrowed, "next to me." The aftermath was a blur of frantic activity. A chair, hastily procured from a side room, was placed beside the Duke's own seat of honor. I was settled into it as if I were made of glass. Isolde's face was a thundercloud of rage, barely concealed behind a strained smile. My father avoided my eyes completely, busying himself with a wine steward. Rosalind looked at me with a new, unsettling expression, a mixture of shock and, for the first time, a flicker of genuine curiosity. I sat beside the Duke of Blackwood, the most powerful man in the room, in a silence that was more profound than any noise. He did not speak to me again for some time. He accepted a glass of water, ignoring the wine, and surveyed the room as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But everything had. The carefully balanced world of my family had been upended by a single, inexplicable act. The statue had been given a voice, a seat, a name. And I was terrified because I did not understand why. The next morning, a crisp, liveried footman from Blackwood Manor delivered an envelope to our door. It was addressed not to my father but to me, Lady Alara. Isolde snatched it from the butler's tray before I could even see it, her fingers like claws. "An invitation," she hissed, her eyes scanning the thick, creamy parchment. "To take tea at the Duke's residence this afternoon." She looked at me then, her face a mask of cold calculation. The fury of the previous night had been banked, replaced by a dangerous, speculative gleam. "What game are you playing, you little snake?" she whispered, her voice low and menacing. "I am playing no game," I said, my own voice surprising me with its steadiness. "I have no idea why he has done this." "Don't lie to me," she spat. "Men like the Duke of Blackwood do not act on whims. You have done something, some pathetic, manipulative ploy to gain his attention." She paced the morning room, her silk wrapper hissing across the rug. "Well, it will not work. He is toying with you, can't you see? A bored predator amusing himself with a field mouse before he snaps its neck. You will make a fool of yourself, and by extension, this entire family." My father entered, looking haggard. "Isolde, please. The girl must go. We cannot offend the Duke. She will embarrass us." "She will embarrass us more if she refuses," he countered, a rare spark of defiance in his eyes. He looked at me. "Alara, you will go. Be polite. Be quiet. Answer his questions and then leave. Do nothing to provoke him." He was pleading with me, not to protect me, but to protect his own peace. And so I went. Dressed in my plainest gray dress, the one Isolde called my mouse costume, I was conveyed in our family carriage to the foreboding gates of Blackwood Manor. The house was like its master, vast, severe, and built of dark, unyielding granite. It did not welcome, it dominated the landscape. I was met at the door by a housekeeper, a woman with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun and an expression that could curdle milk. "Lady Alara," she said, her voice crisp. "I am Mrs. Gable. His Grace is expecting you in the library." She led me through halls of polished stone and dark wood, where the only sound was the echo of our footsteps. There were no frivolous decorations, only portraits of stern-faced ancestors who seemed to judge me as I passed. This was a house of substance, not style. A house built to last, not to charm. I felt a strange kinship with it. The library was breathtaking. It was a cathedral of knowledge, 2 stories high, with shelves stretching up into the shadowed heights, accessible by a rolling ladder of dark, gleaming mahogany. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and beeswax. A fire crackled in a fireplace large enough to stand in. And there, by the window, silhouetted against the pale afternoon light, stood the Duke. He turned as I entered. "Lady Alara, thank you for coming." "Your Grace," I murmured, curtsying. Mrs. Gable gestured to a tea service set before the fire. "I will leave you," she said, and departed with a quiet click of the door. The silence she left behind was heavy, charged with my own anxiety. The Duke gestured to one of the large leather armchairs. "Please, sit." This time, the offer of a seat felt less like a command and more like a genuine courtesy. I sat, perching on the edge of the cushion. He took the chair opposite me, the firelight catching the sharp planes of his face. He did not engage in small talk. He poured the tea himself, his movements economical and precise. He handed me a cup. Our fingers brushed for a fraction of a second. A jolt, like static electricity, shot up my arm. "I imagine," he began, his voice a low rumble, "that you are wondering about my actions last night." I clutched the warm porcelain of my cup. "The thought had crossed my mind, Your Grace. My apologies if I caused you distress. That was not my intention. My intention was to correct an injustice." He took a sip of his tea, his storm-gray eyes fixed on me over the rim of the cup. "I do not care for cruelty, Lady Alara, particularly when it is disguised as social propriety." I stared at him, speechless. He had seen it all. Not just my standing in the alcove, but the meaning behind it. The casual, calculated cruelty of my stepmother. The deliberate act of erasure. "But why?" I whispered. "Why did you notice me at all?" He set his cup down. "Because I have seen you before. Or rather, I have heard you." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense. 3 years ago, I was visiting a neighbor of your father's. I was walking the boundary of our properties, near the old quarry on your family's land. Your father was having the north wing of your house refaced. I heard a voice. It was explaining, with remarkable clarity, the structural necessity of cantilevered supports to one of the stonemasons. The voice spoke of load-bearing walls, of tensile strength, of the sublime geometry of a well-designed arch. It was a voice that understood that a building is not merely a collection of rooms, but a living thing, a balance of forces. My heart hammered against my ribs. I remembered that day. Old Thomas, the master mason, had been grumbling about the architect's plans. I, who had spent my lonely childhood devouring my grandfather's books on engineering and architecture, had timidly pointed out a solution. I never dreamed anyone else had been listening. I looked for the architect, the learned tutor who was speaking with such passion. The Duke continued, his voice softer now. "But I saw only you, a young woman in a plain dress, with stone dust on her cheek." He paused, letting the memory settle between us. "I have a formidable memory for things that interest me, Lady Alara, and intelligence interests me far more than a pretty face or a skillful dance step. Last night, I saw that same intelligent woman being treated like a piece of unwanted furniture, and I found I did not approve." The air left my lungs in a rush. It was not pity. It was not a cruel game. It was recognition. He had not seen a plain, awkward girl. He had seen a mind. For the first time in my life, someone had looked past the surface Isolde had so carefully painted and had seen the structure beneath. A single tear escaped and traced a hot path down my cheek. I hastily wiped it away, mortified. "My apologies, Your Grace." "There is no need to apologize for an honest emotion," he said quietly. He rose and walked to one of the towering shelves. He returned with a large leather-bound book. He placed it in my hands. The title was embossed in gold, "On the Principles of Roman Aqueducts." It was a rare scholarly text I had only ever read about. "I thought this might interest you," he said. "Consider it a loan." I clutched the book to my chest. It felt heavier than its weight in paper and leather. It felt like a key. "Thank you," I breathed, the words inadequate. "You are welcome, Lady Alara," he said, and for the first time I saw the barest hint of something in his expression. Not a smile, but the ghost of one, a slight softening of his severe mouth. "I hope you will call upon me again to discuss it." The visits became a weekly ritual. Each time I would arrive at Blackwood Manor, my heart aflutter with a nervous, unfamiliar excitement. Each time, Mrs. Gable would greet me with a nod that was now, I thought, a fraction less frosty. And each time, the Duke and I would sit in his library, the great book open between us, and we would talk. We spoke of architecture, of mathematics, of history. He treated my opinions with a grave seriousness that was more intoxicating than any flattery. He would listen, truly listen, as I spoke of the beauty of a perfect equation or the genius of a Gothic vault. He would challenge my assumptions, push me to defend my theories, and in doing so, he helped me build a confidence in myself that I had never known. The prison of my own making, the belief in my own worthlessness, began to show cracks. He, in turn, began to reveal parts of himself. He spoke of his younger brother, Edmund, a brilliant, vibrant young man who had been struck down by a fever that had swept through the capital. "The physicians did nothing," Alaric said one afternoon, his voice rough with remembered grief as he stared into the fire. "They were fools, clinging to outdated notions while people died. Edmund should have lived." He unrolled a set of architectural plans across the large library table. "I am funding the construction of a new hospital, one based on principles of light and air, sanitation and science. It will be a memorial to him, but more than that, it will be a place of healing, not of dying." I studied the plans, my fingers tracing the elegant lines. He had designed much of it himself. It was brilliant, ambitious, but I saw something. A small detail, a potential weakness in the support structure for the main atrium. It was a subtle flaw, one that only someone who had spent years studying such things would notice. My blood ran cold. To point it out would be an act of supreme arrogance. He was a duke, a powerful, intelligent man. I was nothing, a girl he had taken pity on. A soul's voice echoed in my head. "You will make a fool of yourself." But then I looked at his face, at the raw pain that still lingered in his eyes when he spoke of his brother. This hospital was more than just a building to him. It was penance. It was a legacy. It had to be perfect. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, I placed my finger on the blueprint. "Your Grace." "Alaric," I said, the use of his given name a terrifying leap. "May I ask about the weight distribution here? If you use a stone-vaulted ceiling of this span, the lateral thrust on these particular columns might be problematic, especially in high winds." He went very still. The air crackled with tension. I thought I had made a terrible mistake. He bent closer, his dark head almost touching mine as he studied the plans. His focus was absolute. I could feel the warmth radiating from him, smell the faint, clean scent of his skin. For a long moment, he was silent. Then, he straightened up and looked at me. His expression was one I had never seen before. It was not anger. It was a raw, unguarded astonishment. "You are right," he said, his voice quiet with revelation. "God in heaven, you are absolutely right. I have been looking at this for months, and I never saw it." He reached out and, without thinking, covered my hand where it rested on the plans. His touch was warm and firm. It was not a fleeting brush of fingers, but a deliberate, grounding contact. A current passed between us, something powerful and unspoken. "Ilara," he said, my name now a familiar sound on his lips. "Thank you." In that moment, something shifted irrevocably. The boundary between us, the vast gulf of rank and circumstance, dissolved. We were no longer a duke and a forgotten girl. We were two minds, two souls that had found their counterpart. He did not let go of my hand, and I did not pull away. The world outside the library, with its cruelties and its expectations, ceased to exist. There was only the firelight, the scent of old books, and the solid, reassuring weight of his hand on mine. Hope, a terrifying and beautiful thing, began to unfurl in my chest like a fragile fern. My stepmother was not a fool. She had allowed my visits to the Duke, seeing them as a passing fancy, a curiosity that would soon fade. But when weeks turned into months, when the servants began to whisper of the way the Duke's carriage was so often seen waiting outside our door, her speculative interest curdled into alarm. This was not part of her plan. I was the drab pawn to be married off quietly to some distant, insignificant country squire, freeing up more of the household funds for Rosalind's glittering future. A connection to the Duke of Blackwood was a prize she had intended for my sister. She confronted me one evening after I returned from the manor, the book on Roman aqueducts tucked under my arm. She cornered me in the hallway, her face pale with fury in the dim candlelight. "This has gone on long enough," she hissed, her fingers digging into my arm. "What are you doing? What spell have you cast on him?" "There is no spell," I said, trying to pull away from her painful grip. "We simply talk." "Talk?" she scoffed, her laugh like the grating of a key in a rusty lock. "Do you take me for an idiot? A man like Alaric of Blackwood does not talk to a plain, penniless nobody for months on end out of simple friendship. He is using you, or worse, you are deluding yourself into thinking his interest is genuine." "It is genuine," I said, the words tasting of a new and fragile conviction. Her eyes narrowed to slits. "I see. So you believe you have him. You believe you will be the next Duchess of Blackwood." She leaned closer, her breath sour. "Let me tell you what will happen. You will be his momentary diversion, and when he tires of you, he will cast you aside. You will be ruined, a laughingstock, and you will have dragged this family's name through the mud with you. I will not allow it." The next day, she acted. A letter arrived for the Duke, penned in my stepmother's elegant looping script. I knew nothing of it, of course. I only knew that my next scheduled visit was met with a polite but firm message delivered by a grim-faced footman. His Grace was not available. Another message the next week yielded the same result. A cold dread began to seep into my bones. Isolde had done something. She was smug, preening at the dinner table. She announced that she had found a most suitable match for me. A baron from the northern marshes, a man 3 times my age with a reputation for drink and a crumbling estate. The contracts were being drawn up. I was to be married within the month. "It is for the best, Alara," she said, her smile a slash of victory. "The Baron is a forgiving man. He is willing to overlook your eccentricities." My father refused to meet my eye. Rosalind looked uncomfortable, pushing food around her plate. "Mother," she said tentatively, "is this not rather sudden?" "Nonsense," Isolde snapped. "It is a wonderful opportunity. Ilara should be grateful." I felt the walls of my old prison closing in again, thicker and more suffocating than before. The hope Alaric had kindled in me flickered, threatening to die. He believed her. Whatever lies she had told him, he had believed them. The thought was a physical pain, a sharp, twisting knife in my heart. The great perceptive Duke had been deceived by a woman as shallow and vicious as Isolde. Or perhaps he had simply grown bored, as she had predicted. Perhaps I was a fool after all. 2 days later, as I sat in my room staring at the bleak future that stretched before me, a summons arrived. Not a polite invitation, but a formal, commanding summons. The Duke of Blackwood required the presence of Lord Valerius, Lady Isolde, Lady Rosalind, and Lady Alara at his residence that evening at 8 o'clock. No reason was given. The command was absolute. Isolde was triumphant. "You see," she crowed, brandishing the heavy parchment. "He wishes to formally sever his acquaintance with you. He will do it in front of all of us, to make it clear that his name is not to be associated with yours. He will likely apologize for any misunderstanding and endorse your match with the Baron. It is perfect." I felt sick. A public humiliation. A final cruel twist of the knife. But I had no choice but to go. We arrived at Blackwood Manor as the clock tower struck 8. The house was lit, but seemed unnervingly quiet. Mrs. Gable met us at the door, her expression as unreadable as ever. She led us not to a drawing room, but back to the library. The room that had become my sanctuary now felt like a courtroom. Alaric was standing before the fire, his back to us. He did not turn when we entered. He was dressed in black, a severe, imposing figure of judgment. He let the silence stretch, a form of subtle torture, before he finally turned to face us. His eyes were like chips of ice. They held no warmth, no recognition, only a cold, controlled fury that was more terrifying than any shouting. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice flat. He gestured to the chairs arranged before his desk. "Please, be seated." It was not a request. We sat. My father fidgeted with his collar. Rosalind looked pale and frightened. Only Isolde seemed composed, a faint, confident smirk playing on her lips. She believed she was in control. Alaric moved to stand behind his large mahogany desk. It was an immediate position of power. On the polished surface lay a single sheet of paper, her letter. "Lady Isolde," he began, his voice dangerously quiet. "I received a letter from you 3 days ago, a letter of concern." Isolde inclined her head graciously. "Your Grace, I felt it was my duty. Ilara is a fragile, impressionable girl. I was so afraid she might misinterpret your kindness." "Indeed," the Duke said, his eyes never leaving her face. "You wrote that she is prone to flights of fancy, that she has constructed a fantasy of a relationship where none exists. You implied she is not entirely stable." "She has a delicate constitution," Isolde murmured, dabbing at a non-existent tear with a lace handkerchief. "Her mother, you see—" "Yes, you mentioned her mother," Alaric cut in, his voice sharp. "You also mentioned that Ilara has been carrying on a clandestine correspondence with a young lieutenant of no fortune, and that her attempts to engage me were merely a ploy to make this other man jealous." My head snapped up. A lieutenant? The lie was so audacious, so specific, it stole my breath. "A sordid but sadly common little tale," Isolde sighed. "An interesting story," Alaric said, his voice dropping even lower. "So I had it investigated." He let that hang in the air. Isolde's smirk wavered. "My agents are remarkably efficient. They discovered that the only lieutenant Ilara has ever spoken to is the 70-year-old gatekeeper at her great-aunt's estate, and that was 5 years ago. They also found no evidence of any correspondence, clandestine or otherwise." He paused. "They are, however, very interested in your accounts, Lady Isolde." The color drained from my stepmother's face. My accounts? I don't know what you mean." "Don't you?" The Duke picked up another sheaf of papers from his desk. "When Ilara's mother died, she left a significant dowry and trust for her daughter. A dowry you have been managing as her guardian. According to these documents, which my solicitors procured this afternoon, that trust is nearly empty. You have been systematically bleeding it for years to fund your gowns, your jewels, and your daughter's social ambitions." My father gasped, looking at his wife in horror. "Isolde? Is this true?" "Lies!" she shrieked, her mask of composure shattering. "These are outrageous lies. That girl has poisoned you against me." "She has never spoken a single ill word of you to me," Alaric said, his voice a whip crack. "Unlike you, Lady Ilara possesses a thing called integrity. I learned of the trust through my own inquiries into her welfare. Inquiries prompted by your venomous, pathetic little letter." He looked down at the documents. "Embezzlement is a serious crime, Lady Isolde, one that carries a prison sentence." Isolde was breathing in ragged gasps, her face a blotchy ruin. She was cornered, defeated. The tyrant was nothing without her power. Rosalind began to weep quietly, her face buried in her hands. She was finally seeing the ugliness that I had lived with my entire life. My father sat stunned, his face ashen, the edifice of his quiet life crumbling around him. And then Alaric looked at me. His eyes, for the first time that evening, softened. "Ilara," he said, his voice gentle, "I believe you have something to say." He was giving me the floor. He had dismantled the enemy, cleared the field of battle, and now he was stepping back, allowing me to strike the final blow, to claim my own victory. I rose from my chair, my legs trembling but steady. All my life I had been silent. I had absorbed the cruelty, the dismissal, the casual disregard, and locked it away inside me. Now, the door to that prison was open. I looked directly at the woman who had tried to erase me. "You called me a snake," I began, my voice clear and strong in the silent room. "But it is you who has been the viper in this house. For 10 years you have whispered poison. You told me I was plain, so I would not look in a mirror. You told me I was foolish, so I would not trust my own mind. You told me I was a burden, so I would learn to shrink myself down to nothing, to take up as little space as possible. I took a step closer. You did not just steal my inheritance. You tried to steal myself. You made me a ghost in my own home, a silent observer of my own life. You stood me in corners and told me it was my preference. You dressed me in gray and told me it was my color. The greatest cruelty was not the things you did, but the way you made me believe I deserved them, that my worthlessness was a fundamental truth of the world. I looked at my father. "And you," I said, my voice thick with a decade of sorrow. "You let her. For the sake of peace, you sacrificed your daughter. You saw her cruelty and you looked away." My father flinched as if struck. "Ilara, I am so sorry." I turned back to Isolde. She was staring at me, her eyes wide with hatred. "But you failed," I said, my voice ringing with a power I never knew I possessed. "You cannot erase a person's soul. You cannot extinguish a mind that wants to learn. I am not fragile, I am not a fool, and I am not a ghost. I am a woman who understands the principles of a solid foundation, and you, Lady Isolde, are nothing but a crumbling facade." I stood there, breathing heavily, the words having scoured me clean. It was over. The poison was out. Alaric stepped forward. "Lord Valerius," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument, "you will see that Lady Isolde is removed from your house. You will make a full and public apology to your daughter, and you will restore every last penny of her stolen inheritance. If you fail to do any of these things, my solicitors will be in contact. As for Lady Isolde, she will be fortunate to avoid prosecution, but she will never be received in civilized society again. I will personally see to it." He then looked at the defeated woman with utter contempt. "Now get out of my house." Isolde, broken and sobbing, was half led, half dragged from the room by my ashen-faced father. Rosalind was the last to leave. She paused at the door and looked at me, her face streaked with tears. "Ilara," she whispered, "I'm sorry. I was blind. I am so sorry." And then she was gone. I was alone with Alaric in the magnificent library. The silence that fell was not heavy, but clean and calm, like the air after a storm. I was shaking, the adrenaline of the confrontation leaving me weak. He came to me, his expression full of a deep, quiet tenderness that made my heart ache. He gently took my hands in his. They were ice cold. "You were magnificent," he said, his voice low and full of emotion. "You did everything," I whispered. "You saved me." "No," he said, his grip tightening on my hands. He lifted them and held them against his chest. I could feel the steady, strong beat of his heart beneath my palms. "I did not save you, Ilara. A foundation cannot be saved. It can only be revealed. I only cleared away the rubble that was hiding you from the world. Your strength, your mind, your integrity, they were always there. I just had the honor of being the first to truly see them." He led me from the library, out onto a stone balcony that overlooked the vast, moonlit gardens of his estate. The cool night air was a balm on my heated skin. We stood in silence for a moment, looking up at the stars, 1,000 points of light in the dark, velvet sky. "I have spent years in solitude," he said, his voice a quiet confession in the darkness. "After my brother died, the world seemed frivolous, full of noise and pretense. I built walls around myself, not unlike this house. I thought I preferred the silence." He turned to face me, his hand still holding mine. "Then I heard your voice in a quarry, speaking of truth and balance. And I have spent these last few months in your company, feeling those walls crumble. You have brought light and meaning back into my quiet world, Ilara. You are the missing piece of the architecture of my own life." My breath hitched. My heart felt too large for my chest. "This is not a proposal born of pity, or of a desire to rescue you," he continued, his gaze intense and unwavering. "This is a proposal born of reverence. I am asking for a partner, for a mind to challenge mine, for a soul to share the silence with. I am asking you to help me design the rest of our lives." He lifted one of my hands to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to my knuckles. "Ilara, will you marry me?" Tears streamed freely down my face now, but they were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of profound, overwhelming joy. of release, of finally arriving home. "Yes," I breathed. "Yes, Alaric, I will." He drew me into his arms, and his mouth found mine. The kiss was not a gentle, hesitant thing. It was deep and certain, a declaration and a promise. It was the end of a long, cold winter and the first day of a glorious, sunlit spring. It was the feeling of being not just seen, but cherished. 1 year later, I stood on that same balcony, but now I was not a guest. I was the Duchess of Blackwood, and this house, this life, was my own. Alaric came to stand behind me, wrapping his strong arms around my waist and resting his chin on my shoulder. Below us, in the gardens, the first roses of summer were in bloom. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured into my hair. I leaned back against him, my hand covering his. "I was thinking about architecture," I said, a smile in my voice, "about how some structures are built to intimidate and some are built to shelter, and how some are built for a single, solitary purpose." In the distance, the new wing of the Edmund of Blackwood Memorial Hospital caught the morning light, its windows gleaming. The plans, the ones I had helped him perfect, had become a reality of stone and glass, a place of healing and hope. My name was on the dedication stone, next to his. Not as his wife, but as his partner in its design. "And what purpose is that?" he asked, his lips brushing my temple. I turned in his arms to face him, to look into the storm-gray eyes that were no longer severe, but filled with a deep and abiding love. "To stand," I said softly, "to endure, and to provide a space where things of value are kept safe." He smiled, a true, warm smile that transformed his face and made my heart sing. He had seen the quiet girl in the corner, the one they wouldn't let sit down, and had recognized her worth. He had not given me a voice. He had simply created a space where I was finally safe enough to use the one I'd had all along. And I knew, with a certainty as solid as the granite foundations of our home, that I would never be invisible again.